Hey guys, Coach Pop here. Thanks for joining me for this week's video lecture. Today we're looking at Strayer's Chapter 17, Revolutions of Industrialization, 1750 to 1914. This is the second of the four chapters in the early modern unit. Again, the long 19th century, if you will. As we have seen, David Christian considers the Industrial Revolution a threshold moment in the evolution of the cosmos, and many geologists have labeled the period after it as the Anthropocene epoch in the history of the planet. Indeed, from this point on, human impact on the environment becomes the major force of change on planet Earth. But how do we explain the Industrial Revolution? Various global forces may have contributed to this revolutionary leap in a similar manner to the factors that led to the agricultural revolution in the Neolithic era. Specifically, population growth combined with an energy crisis that was a result of deforestation and a labor crisis that was a result of the abolition of slavery. These global forces created conditions that required a bold new direction. That direction involved developing mechanized technologies using non-renewable sources of energy. The consequences of that direction were great indeed. On the one hand, the environmental consequences of industrialization were largely negative. The extraction of natural resources permanently altered the landscape, the burning of fossil fuels like coal and oil polluted the air, and the disposal of human and industrial waste polluted the water. On the other hand, the economic growth as a consequence of industrialization was so powerful that it would transform entire societies in Western Europe, the United States, and Russia, and eventually the whole world. Most of these transformations were positive, but some were negative. The traditional rise of the West narrative implies that Western Europe had unique advantages that inevitably led to its leading role in the Industrial Revolution. This proposition has been challenged of late. When looking at the pre-industrial world, many would not see an inherent advantage for Europe. China arguably had the world's most impressive technology, and India and the Islamic world had many noteworthy accomplishments. These societies were also enjoying strong commercial activity and long-distance trade networks that were noteworthy for both their volume and age. Even if it was not predestined for industrial domination, there were indeed certain conditions within Europe that contributed to it. The inability to unite Europe in the millennium after the collapse of the Western Roman Empire was a long-term asset for European growth. With numerous smaller states locked in centuries of competition, a culture of constantly looking for an edge over one's rivals characterized European politics. This would lead to state support for innovation. As these competitive states were fairly young and grew out of the economic collapse of the post-Roman world, they were constantly trying to find new and secure sources of state revenue. Thus, the state frequently developed alliances with merchant groups who promised taxable income streams in return for monopolies, state support, and military aid. While a few other societies around the world had also created market-based economies in some form, Europe had a further advantage in that it was directly involved in global trade networks. Once Europeans had established direct trade with India and China, merchants began to import the less expensive and superior quality manufactured goods from Asia. As European consumers wanted these cheaper but better quality goods, these imports threatened domestic production. Europeans, in order to compete, began to experiment with labor and cost-saving devices, contributing to a culture of innovation. Europeans were also fortunate to be close to the newly discovered Americas, where the Great Dying gave them access to silver and a variety of food supplies and timber, as well as new land to develop plantations with slave labor. This windfall of bullion, calories, and profits from America provided an essential boost in Europe's economic competition with the Asian economies. Although the Industrial Revolution began in Britain, it was not planned and it unfolded in a rather spontaneous manner. Many would not have predicted the rainy Northern Island Kingdom to become a world power, but Britain did enjoy a few advantages, most of which only became clear over time. Obviously, possessing a variety of American colonies provided access to American food, profits, and calories, but Spain also had a large colonial empire and was very late to industrialize. Importantly, Britain had a commercial society where landowners had pushed small tenant farmers out in favor of enclosed fields for livestock, urban merchants thrived, and aristocrats engaged in money-making entrepreneurial enterprises. On top of this, the British were religiously tolerant, welcoming refugees from the continent, many of whom possessed scientific knowledge and technical skills. A stable political system allowed the rule of law as established by legal precedents. In such a political environment, owners of capital were willing to take risks. Unlike their continental colleagues who tended to focus on abstract theories and mathematical principles, British scientists engaged in practical observations of the world as opposed to theoretical debates. This meant that their scientific institutions were much more in tune with the needs of engineers. While suffering from famously gloomy and wet weather, the British did enjoy a favorable geography. Water, in the form of rain, rivers, and canals and seaports, provided a natural transportation infrastructure. Furthermore, plentiful supplies of coal and iron were near each other. Britain's island location freed it from the political instability and the military campaigns of the French Revolution and Napoleonic era. So in this map, you can see the green major industrial areas, many of them springing up near iron ore fields and coal fields. And again, if you look, it's not hard to see why Britain, England in particular, had a particular geographical advantage, but also note too, particularly with coal and iron fields, France and what would eventually become Germany also had significant advantages. And then the use of railroads by 1850 to sort of link together the factories and the sources of these raw materials. The shift from an agricultural economy at the beginning of the century to an industrial one at the end of it dramatically influenced daily life in Great Britain. While it was a traumatic process for many, it affected different classes in different ways. With land and titles that extended back to the Middle Ages, the British aristocracy continued to be the elite of this new industrial society. As only a few thousand families owned half the cultivated land in Britain, this class remained wealthy. They employed tenant farmers who in turn hired agricultural wage laborers to work the land. With rapid urbanization, the demand for food would remain strong. For most of the century, the aristocracy continued to exert its power in Parliament. The British aristocracy declined as a powerful class, however, when new sources of urban wealth from entrepreneurs, industrialists, and bankers began to challenge the old wealth of land. By the end of the 19th century, landowners were no longer the main base of power in the country. Many aristocrats found high-level positions in the imperial administration. Those who benefited most from industrialization were in the relatively newly formed middle classes. The term middle classes, however, includes a wide variety of people. At the upper end were industrialists, bankers, and entrepreneurs who amassed large fortunes and entered the social world of the declining aristocracy. They sought the various markers of social privileges, such as knighthoods and other royal honors, which the aristocratic elite had once monopolized. The middle class included large numbers of smaller businessmen and professionals whose common ideology was classical liberalism, a belief in small government, education, and the law as guaranteed by constitutions. One of the most famous examples of this ideology is Samuel Smiles' wildly popular book, Self-Help, which stressed hard work and self-reliance and argued that poverty was due to a lack of effort. According to the middle-class ideal, respectable women should not work and should concern themselves with the domestic sphere and such new consumer activities as shopping. While these women left the labor force in the early 19th century, by the end of the century, an increasing number of young middle-class women sought work in offices as secretaries. Generally, they expected to work a few years before marrying. The end of the century also saw a rise in the lower end of the middle class as the number of clerks, salespeople, and teachers grew. These clerical professions did not pay all that well, but they were desk jobs and thus distinguished the workers from the laboring classes. Working in the cities, towns, and villages, and factories, mines, and farms, the working classes represented about 70% of the British society. They suffered the most and gained the least from the process of industrialization. Their lives were dramatically impacted by the process of rapid urbanization. By 1851, in a moment that marked a turning point in world history, the majority of Britons now lived in cities. At the end of the century, London had 6 million inhabitants, making it the world's largest city. Unfortunately, rapid urbanization resulted in poorly planned cities. Living conditions were cramped and dirty, with epidemic diseases taking a terrible toll on the urban poor. In addition to new housing situations, the British working class experienced new and often difficult working conditions. Long hours were nothing new to British workers, but the enclosed factories, which were often dark and cold, were a dramatic contrast to farms and small artisanal workshops of the previous century. Furthermore, the near constant surveillance by management seeking to extract the most labor possible per hour angered many who desired more independence, freedom, and respect. In the early 19th century, many factory managers preferred women and children as laborers because they were viewed as not likely to challenge orders. However, as the industrial workforce grew, male workers pushed women out of the factories or into the least prestigious unskilled jobs. Working-class women generally worked in factories or as domestic servants until marriage, when they frequently left the workforce to raise children. In response to these conditions, members of the working classes, who did not have the right to vote because they owned no property, remember that, began to organize in order to find new ways to protest. Viewed as a serious threat in the first decades of the century, unions did not achieve legal status until 1824 and were still viewed with suspicion, if not outright hostility, by factory and mine owners who feared their nationwide organizing and the use of strikes to achieve their goals. An early experimenter in a form of socialism, this wealthy textile manufacturer created a model industrial community in New Lanark, Scotland. He promoted decent and spacious housing, higher wages, and education for all children of the workers of the factory. The workers, in fact, were part owners in this factory as well. This German spent most of his adult life in Britain, where he developed his radical critiques of capitalism, history, and revolutionary change. He called upon the revolutionary traditions of the French Revolution and merged it with what he called a scientific analysis of history to argue that capitalism was inherently unstable and would collapse in the flames of a worldwide workers' revolution. However, he failed to foresee the rise of a large middle class of white-collar workers and the spread of nationalism. Both forces weakened the revolutionary potential of Britain and other industrializing societies. Nonetheless, his followers would form a variety of political parties, with the communists being among the most radical. While Marx may have missed the mark in his analysis of the trajectory of history, his ideas did appeal to many workers. In the 1890s, a British variant of socialism emerged in the formation of a new political party. Despite the wave of strikes from 1910 to 1913, the Labour Party rejected class struggle in the name of social democracy, running candidates for parliament and working for reform. British working class politics were decidedly more moderate than the radical movements on the continent. Material conditions for workers improved by the end of the century. The growing middle class served as a kind of buffer between workers and aristocrats, and British nationalism prevented workers from aligning with their continental counterparts. Reformism pulled the rug out from underneath radical revolutionaries. At the dawn of the 20th century, Britain found itself in a period of relative economic decline. Thanks to its early industrialization, the country now had a rust belt of aging machinery that fared poorly with the more advanced factories in Germany and the United States. Another social effect of industrialization can be seen in several massive waves of migration. Indeed, just over half of the European population migrated to cities in the 19th century. Even more impressive was the departure of some 20% of the population, 50 to 55 million people, for overseas destinations between 1815 and 1939. Large numbers of British settled in Australia and New Zealand, overwhelming the local population and creating distant versions of Britain. In Algeria, South Africa, Rhodesia, Kenya, and elsewhere, smaller populations of Europeans set up settler colonies and instituted sharp racial divisions between themselves and the native Africans. About 20% of all European immigrants left for Latin America. In Cuba, Mexico, and South America, immigrants from Spain, Portugal, and Italy instantly achieved superior social status over the mestizo, mulatto, Native American, and African populations by virtue of their whiteness. But the U.S. offered the most compelling pull factors for European immigrants, as there was the possibility of finding both land and industrial jobs. 30 million Europeans arrived between 1820 and 1930. While a national myth stressed the notion of a melting pot, the reality was that Protestants from Britain and Germany looked down upon the later arriving Catholics and Jews from Southern and Eastern Europe. After the emancipation of the serfs in 1861, some 10 million Russians and Ukrainians migrated to Siberia in search of land, freedom, and other opportunities. The Tsarist state actively promoted this migration in order to form a bulwark against Chinese expansion under the Qing dynasty. In this map, you can see the migration patterns out of Europe in this period. The width of the arrows denotes the number of people. One of the things that I find really interesting about this, as mentioned before, the number of Europeans from Southern Europe in particular who end up in South America is pretty significant. Also, it only depicted here as South Africa, but there's other migrants from various European countries, but mostly from Britain throughout Africa. Note here, too, the Scandinavian people who end up in Canada and then will slowly sort of work their way south, many of them ending up in what is now Minnesota. While the Industrial Revolution may have begun in Great Britain, it soon spread and became a global phenomenon. As industrialization took hold, certain common patterns began to emerge. Wherever industrialization succeeded, production increased dramatically, but economic progress also brought disruptions to traditional social structures. Generally speaking, the aristocracy and peasantry declined, the middle class expanded, workers attempted to improve their conditions, and the roles of women and children changed. But each culture adapted in slightly different ways. In Western Europe, for example, Germany industrialized quickly and focused on heavy industry, while France took a much slower approach and had less social disruption. Japan's industrialization incorporated aspects of their traditional society to create another unique variety. The two most dramatically different models, however, can be seen in the United States and Russia. Industrialization began in the U.S. in the 1820s with the New England textile industry. Cheaper cotton from the southern states and mechanical technologies from England helped to create this foundation for industrialization. Thanks to access to resources and an infusion of European capital, the United States saw a rapid increase of industrialization after the Civil War. Importantly, the Americans developed self-sustaining investments and soon did not need to rely on foreign investment. By 1914, the United States produced over 1/3 of the world's industrial output. How do we explain the explosive growth that happened at a rate much faster than elsewhere in the world? In fact, several developments contributed not only to the growth of, from an economic perspective, but also to a uniquely American way of life. While Americans generally distrust big government, government support was essential to this spectacular growth. Land grants, favorable tax policies, and a tolerance of monopolies allowed massive industrial concerns to invest capital, increase production, and reap enormous profits. Americans pioneered new techniques of mass production, including assembly lines, and methods of mass marketing, such as mail-order catalogs and urban department stores, to create a culture of consumption. Indeed, consumerism became the ideology that created demand. Free of Europe's aristocratic prejudices, Americans came to hail self-made industrialists like Ford, Carnegie, and Rockefeller as the embodiment of an entrepreneurial spirit. These capitalists became the heroes of a national narrative. Hard work in a land of opportunity could allow anyone to succeed. However, as in Europe, the working class faced difficult lives with long hours in factories and housing in cramped tenement buildings. While there were strikes, which, as in 1877, could become violent, with state militias and federal troops being called in, and there were tense relations between the classes, American labor failed to organize as a political party. Socialism had few followers in a culture that admired independence and disliked the idea of big government. The labor movement never took hold in the U.S. to the degree it did in other industrial nations. But why not? Among the key factors were unions that focused on skilled laborers rather than on more radical, unskilled workers, racial, ethnic, and religious tensions among the diverse American labor force, which hindered worker solidarity, and a standard of living that was higher than elsewhere in the world. Together, along with a growing white-collar middle class, radical politics found few adherents. Although there were reform movements such as the small farmers of the populist movement who rallied against banks, industrialists, and the financial system, as well as both major political parties claiming that they were in the pockets of East Coast money, and the progressives who sought to reform working, living, and sanitation conditions to make American life better, socialism in any form won few supporters. In this map of industrialization in the United States in 1900, you see, first of all, how spread out the industrial centers are relative to Europe, for example. Areas that are definitely linked to coal mines, iron ore mines, and to precious metal mines. One thing to note here is the stars. These are areas where there were very significant incidents involving miners who were trying to strike or workers who were trying to strike, and in some cases the military actually being called in to put down these rebellions. Halfway around the world, Russia was the complete opposite of the United States in many ways. Indeed, since its inception, Russia had been controlled by a politically repressive absolute monarch and dominated by a strong but small aristocracy, despite a large but weak peasantry. While in the United States change often came from below, Russia had a history of state-sponsored change and open hostility toward popular movements. Two examples of this top-down tendency can be seen in the westernization reforms initiated by Peter the Great and the emancipation of the serfs in 1861 after the disastrous Crimean War. Starting in the 1890s, the Russian state used foreign capital to fund an industrialization policy based upon railways and heavy industry. While the gains were impressive, the social dislocation caused by the rise of a new middle class and a new but impoverished working class, known in Marxism as the proletariat, created serious social instability. Rapidly built factories and industrial slums created a culture of conflict and confusion. The industrial working class in Russia was quite small, perhaps only 5% of the total population, but their conditions and standard of living were much worse than their counterparts in the U.S. In their often dire circumstances, they illegally founded the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party in 1898 and sought to use Marxism to create profound change in Russia. They soon became increasingly radicalized, and some strands in the party began calling for revolution. During a disastrous war with Japan, there was a spontaneous uprising in St. Petersburg in 1905. Workers went out on strike and formed various councils known as Soviets. The Tsar responded with repression, but also reluctantly granted limited reforms such as the formation of a parliament known as the Duma. As these measures were only half-hearted and limited, they primarily served to raise and then dash expectations. The various revolutionary movements grew rapidly after 1905 as dissatisfaction with the state of Russia spread throughout society. During another disastrous war, Russia once again plunged into revolution. By the end of the year, Lenin, leader of the radical Marxist Bolshevik Party, was in power and embarked on a grand revolutionary experiment. So in this map, you can see the biggest thing to see here, first of all, is there's still, despite emancipation of the serf, a great deal of peasantry in Russia who are continuing to express their dissatisfaction with the government of the Tsar in the purple area. The boxes are the Soviets that are created by the workers. If you notice, they are typically near industrial centers, but these are the collectives that are set up to look out for the rights and the vision of the workers in those areas. Notice too that there's a great deal of mutiny, both in the Army and Navy, and so up until we get to 1917 with the Communist Revolution, it's not hard to see why people are so dissatisfied with the Tsarist state. Until the 20th century, Japan was the only nation outside of Europe and North America to undergo major industrialization. Even so, non-industrialized societies still felt the impact. This was especially the case in Latin America. The struggle for independence in Spanish South America was long and destructive, but in the end it had very little impact on existing social structures. After achieving independence, the Spanish colonies in the Americas and formerly Portuguese Brazil descended into a series of international wars and regional rebellions. Bolivar's dream of South American unity failed. Domestic politics were characterized by bitter disputes between conservative and progressive forces. This constant tension between conservatives and liberals created political instability, allowing military strongmen known as caudillos to come to power and rule in an authoritarian manner. Latin American society was dominated by white Creole males, and the vast majority of mixed-race Native American and African peoples were largely impoverished and repressed. While Latin America did not industrialize, changes to the global transportation and communication systems brought Latin America into a closer economic relationship with the industrialized states. Generally speaking, Latin America exported raw materials to fuel industrialization in North America and Europe. This included various metals such as silver from Mexico, tin from Bolivia, and copper from Chile to the north, particularly to the United States. The Amazon basin produced rubber, and Peru sent bird guano used as fertilizer to the industrial world. Other nations produced food crops such as beef from Argentina, coffee from Brazil and Guatemala, and bananas from various Central American states. In return, Europe and the United States sold various industrial goods such as textiles, machinery, tools, and weapons to consumers in Latin American markets. Moreover, capital investments from the North stimulated growth in railways and mines, but also led to foreign control of key sectors of the economy, thus reducing regional sovereignty. The question is then, are they becoming more like Europe? Latin American elites looked to Europe and desired to emulate Europe in their societies. Economic growth led to rapid urbanization and the creation of new modern cities such as Buenos Aires. And Latin American governments encouraged immigration from Europe with a variety of promises to poor Italians and others in order to make their population more white. The beneficiaries of this export economy were the small elite class, about 1% of the population, and middle-class urbanites, perhaps 8% of the population. But there was little trickle-down from the export boom. In cities, unions grew and engaged in strikes, but they were met with brutal repression. The vast majority of the population remained poor and in the countryside. This major revolution, which is not the same thing as its independence from Spain, came much later than others in the Atlantic world. It saw the death of 1 million people, 10% of the population at the time, in various violent conflicts among various political factions. While the most radical groups did not seize power, the 1917 Constitution marked a radical progressive change for Mexico. Yet the Mexican Revolution had limited impact outside of Mexico. Latin America's economic growth was not independent, but a dependent form of development that relied on exporting raw materials to Europe and the United States and importing manufactured goods and capital. This led to key sectors of the economy being controlled by foreign concerns, such as the United Fruit Company, a United States corporation in Central America. To protect its economic and political interests in the region, the United States intervened with its military in Cuba, Haiti, the Dominican Republic, Nicaragua, and Mexico. It also controlled the Panama Canal and Puerto Rico. In this map of South America, you can see, again, relatively small degree of urbanization. Its largest factor is to supply the raw materials that are exported to industrial countries. These are all depicted here. Note as well the waves of the European immigrants coming in and the United States, which never directly invades Latin America, but nonetheless has significant control over its economies because of the establishment of these so-called banana republics, these large corporations that come in and are basically calling the shots. I want to thank you for joining me for this rather long video lecture. This is a rather long chapter relative to, say, the last one. I hope you were able to get all the information that you need, and I look forward to seeing you in class.